She didn't slam the door. That's what nobody understood. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices echoing down the hallways, no tearful goodbye speech, no final look back. Brittany Williams simply left. 6 years. 6 years of showing up before anyone else arrived. 6 years of reading the room before Ji Hwan even walked into it. 6 years of being the quiet engine behind one of the most feared men in Seoul. And she walked away from all of it on a Tuesday morning with nothing but a resignation letter sealed in a cream envelope and the kind of stillness that only comes from a decision you've been carrying too long. The letter was on his desk before he arrived. 2 paragraphs. Professional, clean. No room for negotiation. His personal secretary found it first. She read it twice, assumed it was a mistake, then called Ji Hwan's phone 4 times before she realized. No, this was real. This was final. By noon, the entire organization knew. By 2 in the afternoon, the theories started. Someone offered her more money. Someone headhunted her from a rival firm. She was starting her own company. She was relocating. She was sick. She was getting married. Nobody, not a single person in that building, guessed the truth. She was leaving because she was in love with him, and she was terrified that he would never love her back. There was a night, 3 weeks before she wrote that letter, that sealed the decision. She hadn't meant to overhear it. She'd come back to collect her laptop after hours, and Min Seo's voice had floated out from the lounge adjacent to Ji Hwan's office. Admit it, you'd fall apart without Brittany. A pause. Then Ji Hwan's voice, even, measured. That's exactly why I can't let her leave. Brittany stood very still in the hallway. He meant trust. He meant competence. He meant the rare, irreplaceable dependability she'd spent 6 years building. She understood that. She understood Ji Hwan well enough to know exactly what he meant. But what she heard, what moved through her like cold water, was the shape of what he hadn't said. Not, I care about her. Not, she matters to me. Only, I need her. She went home. She sat in her apartment for a long time. She thought about 6 years of mornings and crises and inside jokes and the way he looked at her sometimes, like she was the only still point in a moving room. And she thought about how none of it had ever once become a conversation. She thought about her mother's question, the one Evelyn had been asking gently for years. Who takes care of the person everyone depends on? She opened her laptop. She wrote the letter. Cha Ji Hwan arrived at his office at exactly 8:47 a.m., the same time he always did. He noticed the envelope immediately, not because finding correspondence on his desk was unusual, but because it was sealed. Brittany never sealed things unless the contents were final. He read it once, set it down, read it again. There's this thing about people like Ji Hwan, people who've spent years making rapid decisions under pressure, who've learned to strip emotion from calculation. They can convince themselves quite thoroughly that they're simply processing information. He told himself he was simply processing information. He called her phone. It rang 4 times. Voicemail. He hung up without leaving a message. Ji Hwan never left messages. It was too uncertain, too open to interpretation, and sat behind his desk with a letter and something deeply uncomfortable moving through his chest that he refused to name. By the end of that first day, he was certain she'd reconsider. By the end of the first week, he understood she wasn't going to. The office felt different in a way that irritated him because he couldn't quantify it. Nothing structural had changed. The organization ran. Decisions got made. And yet, there was this persistent low-level wrongness, like a room with one window boarded up. Technically fine, functionally lit, but missing something you don't fully appreciate until it's gone. He didn't understand it yet. He would. Brittany had gone home to Atlanta, not to hide, not to collapse. She went home the way people go back to the places that built them, to remember who she was before she became everything to everybody else. Her mother, Evelyn Williams, took one look at her daughter standing in the doorway with a suitcase and that particular expression. The one that said, "I'm fine," while the eyes said something entirely different and didn't ask a single question. She just pulled her inside, sat her at the kitchen table, and put a plate of food in front of her. It wasn't until the second night, the house quiet, and the two of them sitting on the back porch listening to Georgia do what Georgia does in the evening, then Evelyn spoke. "When was the last time someone took care of you?" Brittany opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. Nothing came out. Evelyn didn't push. She just nodded slowly like she'd already known the answer, and reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand. That was the moment Brittany cried. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just quietly, the way you cry when you've been holding something for so long, your body simply stops asking permission. Her brother Marcus appeared in the doorway behind them, pretending he wasn't eavesdropping, pretending he'd just come out for air. He'd always been like that, performing casualness while his protective instincts ran at full capacity. He handed them both glasses of sweet tea, sat on the steps, and said nothing for a long time. Then, very carefully, "This about Jihuan?" Brittany didn't answer. Marcus nodded. That was enough. He didn't push either. That was the thing about a good family. They held space without colonizing it. They loved you loudly enough that you never doubted it, and quietly enough that you could still breathe. She stayed 2 weeks, ate her mother's cooking, sat in her old room, let herself be fussed over without deflecting it. And somewhere in those 2 weeks, she remembered something important. She was actually quite easy to love. She just spent 6 years making herself indispensable instead of visible. Back in Seoul, Jihuan hired 3 people to cover what Brittany had done alone. 3, and still, somehow, things kept falling through cracks she would have caught in her sleep. His cousin Minseo found this absolutely hilarious. Minseo had always been the one person Jihuan couldn't quite manage. Too sharp, too honest, too entertained by his blind spots to be properly intimidated by him. She appeared in his office on a Wednesday evening, uninvited, poured herself tea from his cabinet like she owned the place, and sat across from him with the expression of someone about to say something he didn't want to hear. "So," she said, "3 assistants. It's a transitional arrangement." She sipped her tea. "You keep looking at your phone." "I'm waiting on a report." "Jihuan?" She set down her cup. "You've checked your phone 11 times in the last hour. Your reports come through email. You're checking to see if she called." The silence that followed was the kind that proves a point better than any argument. Minseo didn't rub it in. She was aggravating, but not cruel. She said quietly, "She's not coming back on her own. You know that, right?" He said nothing. She stood, smoothed her jacket, walked toward the door, paused, the way people do when they've been saving the most important thing for last. Every single time something went wrong, every genuinely difficult moment, you didn't call your security team first. You didn't call your lawyers. You called her. She let that settle. Think about what that means. She left him alone with his tea and his 11 missed non-calls and the question he wasn't ready to answer yet. Hey, if you're already this invested in these two, just wait, because what happens next is where everything starts to shift. Stay right here. 4 months after she walked out, Brittany Williams walked into the grand ballroom of the Sejong Cultural Center in Seoul. She hadn't planned on being back so soon, but the cultural exchange organization she'd joined, connecting Korean and African American artists, musicians, and entrepreneurs, had nominated her to represent their newest initiative at a major fundraising gala. And Brittany Williams did not turn down opportunities just because they were inconvenient. That was literally the whole point of everything she'd been rebuilding. She looked extraordinary. Deep burgundy dress that fit the way good clothes are supposed to fit. Not fighting her body, not apologizing for it, just celebrating it. Her posture was the kind you can't perform. It came from somewhere real. She'd done the work in those 4 months, not the kind of work people talk about online, the quiet kind, therapy kind, long phone call with your mother kind, journaling at 2 a.m. kind. The kind that doesn't look like transformation until you walk into a room and realize you're not scanning it for threats anymore. She was halfway through a conversation with a Korean jazz musician when she felt it, not heard it, not saw it, felt it. That particular shift in atmospheric pressure that she'd spent 6 years unconsciously calibrating to. She turned slowly. Ji-hwan was standing 20 feet away. He looked exactly the same and somehow entirely different. Same controlled composure, same expensive cut of jacket, same way of occupying a room without appearing to try. But there were shadows under his eyes that weren't there before, a tension at the corner of his jaw that she recognized, because she'd spent years learning the difference between his professional mask and his actual face. He was already looking at her. Of course he was. Their eyes met across the room for exactly 3 seconds, which, in that kind of charged silence, is basically an eternity, and then Brittany did something that surprised even her. She smiled. Not the professional one, the real one. Small and complicated and entirely involuntary. He crossed the room. "You look well," he said. "You look tired," she replied. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest crack in the composure. "That's accurate." "The 3 replacements not working out?" He paused just long enough to confirm it. "We're managing." "Of course you are." She lifted her champagne glass. "How did you end up here tonight?" "We sponsor this gala. We have for 3 years." He tilted his head slightly. "You didn't know?" She hadn't, and from the way he asked, genuinely, without any smugness, he seemed to understand the coincidence wasn't manufactured. They both stood with that knowledge for a moment. "Are you happy?" he asked. The question landed differently than she expected. Not small talk, not pleasantry. He was looking at her the way he used to look at difficult decisions, with his full attention, like the answer actually mattered. "Yes," she said. He nodded. She watched something move across his face that she couldn't quite read. Not relief. Something more complicated than relief. "Good," he said. But his voice did something quiet on that single word that didn't sound like good at all. He excused himself 20 minutes later. She watched him go. Then she turned back to her conversation, set down her champagne, and spent the next hour being extremely good at pretending she wasn't thinking about the look on his face when she said yes. Their worlds kept crossing after that. It wasn't manufactured. Seoul was large, but certain circles within it were small, and the cultural business intersection they both now occupied was smaller still. They ran into each other at a charity art auction, at a restaurant where they were seated at adjacent tables by absolute cosmic comedy, at a government partnership meeting neither of them had known the other would attend. Each time it was easier. The boss-assistant dynamic that had structured every interaction for 6 years was gone. Nothing to maintain. No professional distance to perform. And without that scaffolding, something underneath it became visible. Something that had been there all along, patient, waiting for the architecture around it to come down. They talked differently now. He asked about her family. She asked about his. He told her things, small, unguarded things, that she was fairly certain he didn't tell most people. She caught herself laughing at something he said, and then being quietly startled by how natural it felt. He noticed everything. Ji-hwan had always been a noticer. It was what made him effective, reading rooms, catching what others missed. But he'd spent 6 years noticing Brittany professionally, her competence, her reliability, her judgment. He hadn't, until now, let himself notice her. The way she talked about her mother with this warmth that had nothing performative in it. The way she ordered food with genuine enthusiasm rather than the careful restraint most people performed at business dinners. The way she laughed at herself when she got something wrong instead of smoothing past it. One evening over dinner, she said something offhandedly, talking about a photo shoot for the organization's new campaign. They were incredible to work with, she paused, choosing words. I'll admit I had a moment, standing there while they adjusted the lighting. You know that specific thought that shows up sometimes. Is everyone looking at me and seeing a capable woman? Or are they seeing a plus-sized woman first and everything else second? She said it lightly, not fishing, not collapsing, just honest. I'm past it most days. Most days I love every single thing about how I look and how I take up space. She traced the rim of her glass. But some days that question still shows up, and I've learned to just let it pass through instead of fighting it. Jihuan was quiet for a moment. How often does it pass through? He asked. Genuine, no flinching. She looked at him. Less than it used to. A lot less. He nodded slowly. Good. And then, without performing significance, he said, because that thought is wrong every single time it shows up. She held his eyes for a beat. Then she picked up her fork and said, You know, that might be the most direct thing you've ever said to me. Don't get used to it, he said dryly. She laughed, and across the table, very quietly, he smiled at the sound of it. He called Minseo on a Thursday evening. I need you to be honest with me about something. Oh, good, she said. You're finally ready to have this conversation. I'm serious. So am I. Go ahead. He was quiet for a long moment. When did you know? He asked. That you loved her? He didn't confirm or deny, but he didn't hang up either. Minseo's voice softened. About 2 years ago, maybe longer. You changed around her in this specific way. Not softer exactly, just less defended. Like you could actually breathe. A pause. She challenged you and you liked it instead of hating it. That's rare for you. She left because she thought I only needed her. He said, I know. She wasn't wrong. Ji-Huan. He could hear her choosing her words carefully. There's a difference between needing someone because they're useful and needing someone because they've become part of how you understand yourself. You confused the two for so long that she couldn't tell them apart. That's not her failure. That's yours. He stayed on the line in silence for a full minute. I have to fix this, he finally said. Yes, and I need you to hear this, not with authority. Her voice was firm. She needs to know you see her. The specific, particular her. Not the function. Her. He ended the call, stood at the window for a long time, and for the first time in years, Chaji Huan, who was professionally afraid of almost nothing, felt genuinely nervous. He started showing up as himself, no agenda, no leverage, no strategic positioning. He called, not about work, just to talk. He asked her opinion on things that had nothing to do with business. He texted her links to articles he thought she'd find interesting, sometimes with a single-word comment, sometimes with no comment at all, which was somehow more intimate than anything elaborately crafted. She noticed the shift immediately. It was disorienting, if she was honest. For 6 years, she'd had an entire internal atlas of Ji-Huan in professional context. This version, open, curious, occasionally and unexpectedly funny, she didn't have maps for. She called her mother. He's not being strategic, she said carefully. That's the strange part. There's nothing to gain from half these conversations. Her mother's voice had that quality, the one that meant I know exactly what I think, but I'm going to let you get there yourself. What does that feel like? Brittany thought about it honestly. like standing on ice and not being sure if it'll hold, and wanting to stay on it anyway. Evelyn Williams smiled. Brittany could hear it through the phone. Baby, that's what trust feels like when you haven't felt it in a while. One evening, they ended up on a walk along the Han River that neither of them had planned. It started as a chance meeting near a coffee shop and extended naturally, the way good conversations do when neither person wants them to end. He told her about growing up in his family, the weight of it, the specific loneliness of being the person everyone's stability depended on, how he'd learned so early to read the room that he'd never quite learned to simply be in it. She told him about watching her parents' marriage, how much she loved them, how lucky she knew she was, and how confusing it had been to grow up surrounded by love, but still feel like what people valued was her usefulness rather than her presence. I kept waiting for someone to just want to know how I was doing, she said. Not because they needed something from me, just because they wanted to know. Jihuan was quiet. She glanced at him. He was looking ahead at the river, but something in his expression, recognition, and something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. I did that to you, he said. She didn't deny it. I knew you better than most people, he continued, and I still missed it. He turned to look at her. I'm sorry, Brittany. The apology was the real kind, not managed, not damage controlled. The kind that comes from someone who's sat with a truth and not flinched. She didn't know what to do with it immediately, so she said quietly, Thank you for saying that. They walked the rest of the river in a new kind of silence. Not empty, not tense, the kind that feels like something being carefully repaired. Okay, listen. Because what he does when she tells him about the job offer, that's the scene I need you to see. She told him about the New York position over dinner 3 weeks later, an international leadership role, building a cultural exchange program across 3 continents based out of New York, everything she'd have described as her dream if you'd asked her 5 years ago what she actually wanted for herself. She watched his face as she said it. She'd gotten good at reading him now, better, maybe, than she'd ever been, because she was reading him as a person instead of as a professional ecosystem she needed to manage. She saw the micro-expression he couldn't quite contain, something quick, something vulnerable. That's extraordinary, he said. I haven't decided yet. Take it. She blinked. Just like that? Brittany. He looked at her levelly. That's everything you've been working toward. Your vision, your platform, your future. Why would I tell you anything other than take it? She studied him. Most people would complicate this. I'm not most people. He said it simply, without vanity. And I'm not going to be the reason you second-guess something that belongs entirely to you. A pause. New York isn't the end of the world. Distance is a logistics problem. We'd figure it out. Something in her chest shifted. Okay? She said slowly. Okay. He held her gaze. I want you to build the thing you've been building. I want you to have every room and every stage and every version of yourself you've been protecting all this time. He paused. I just also want to be there for it, if you'll let me. She sat with that for a long moment. That might be the most emotionally evolved thing you've ever said. Minseo's been coaching me. She laughed, genuinely, fully. And across the table, Jihuan's face did something remarkable. It relaxed. The quiet, slightly unguarded version of him that she'd been seeing in pieces over the past weeks arrived, completely. She saw it. She thought, oh, there he is. That's actually him. But fear is not always rational, and history has weight. She accepted the position. She told herself she needed to make choices from her own center, that she wasn't going to build her future around a maybe, however beautiful the maybe was. that the whole point of everything she'd rebuilt these past months was that she didn't need a reason to stay. She had to be choosing toward something, not just away from her own loneliness. The departure date was set, 3 weeks. He called her the morning after she accepted, asked if they could talk. She said yes. They met at his apartment. High floor, city light through windows, soles spread below like a circuit board. He'd made tea himself. They talked for 3 hours. About her vision for the New York program, about his family's history, things he'd never said in 6 years of daily proximity, about Min Seo's relentless accuracy, about the cultural exchange work Brittany had been building and what it meant to her and why. He asked questions that proved he'd been paying real attention, not just to what she said, but to what she meant underneath it. At some point past midnight, there was a lull, the comfortable kind. "I don't want you to go," he said. "Ji-hwan, I know, that's not what I'm asking." He held up a hand gently. I'm not going to pretend I'm fine. I'm working on finding the right way to say what I actually mean. I'm not quite there yet." He looked at her steadily. "But I wanted you to know I'm not performing acceptance I don't feel." She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said softly. Neither of them pushed further, but when she left and sat in the car in the dark, she didn't start the engine for 10 minutes. What she was feeling was real and big and terrifying in the specific way that only good things are. She left for the airport before dawn on a Thursday. Practical reasons: international flight, early check-in, avoid traffic. All true, but she also knew, somewhere below the practical reasons, that a proper goodbye would undo her. She needed to be on the plane before her own feelings could vote. She got in the car. Min Seo called Ji-hwan at 5:30 in the morning. "She's on her way to the airport." He was already awake, barely slept. "I know." "Ji-hwan." "I know, Min Seo." "Then why are you still in your apartment?" A silence. "Because..." He stopped. "Because why? Because you're scared? Good, you should be scared. The things worth having are the things that frighten you." Her voice was serious in a way it almost never was. "You have spent your entire life being exactly what everyone needed you to be. Reliable, sacrificial, unshakable. But she never wanted any of that from you. She wanted you to see her. Specifically, completely. And she's leaving because she doesn't believe you do. A beat. Do you?" He didn't answer, but he was already moving. He found her in a quiet corridor near international departures. A long, pale hallway, the kind airports have at 5-something in the morning when the light is still apologetic and the world hasn't fully committed to the day yet. She was standing with her carry-on, checking her phone, when she heard footsteps with a rhythm she recognized before she even looked up. She turned. Ji-hwan, slightly out of breath, which she'd never seen in her life. No jacket, just a shirt, collar open, like he'd left so fast that presentation hadn't made the list. They stared at each other. "You drove here," she said. "Yes." "At 5 in the morning." "Yes." She let out a breath. It came out a little unsteady. "Ji-hwan." "Let me say this." Not commanding, almost asking. "Please." She closed her mouth. He came closer, stopped a few feet away, and for a moment he just looked at her, the way people look at something they've been seeing clearly for the first time, stunned by their own previous blindness. "You thought I loved what you did for me," he said, "that I'd confused my need for your competence with something real." A pause. "You weren't entirely wrong to wonder. I let years pass where I relied on you, valued you, and told myself that was enough. It wasn't." "No," she said quietly. "It wasn't. But underneath all of it, underneath the professional trust and the daily reliance, something else was growing that I didn't examine, because examining it meant admitting I wasn't as in control as I believed. He held her gaze. You challenged me. People don't challenge me, Brittany. They manage me. They accommodate me. You walked in every day and told me when I was wrong and made me laugh and held me to something better, not because it was your job, but because it was your character. She wasn't blinking. You cared about people in my organization, actually. You remembered names, circumstances, histories. You noticed things I was too busy to see. He paused. I kept calling you during every crisis, not for professional reasons, because when things went wrong, you were the voice I wanted, not my security team, not my lawyers. Yours. She felt the back of her eyes go warm. I was keeping you because you were the only person in my life I didn't feel I had to perform for. His voice shifted. I didn't know what to call that, so I didn't call it anything, and you ran because my silence felt like the answer. It did, she admitted. It felt exactly like the answer. I know. He stepped closer. So let me say it now. Clearly, no professional framing, just the truth. He looked at her like there was nothing in that corridor except her. I love your stubbornness, your ridiculous moral compass that makes you argue with me even when I'm technically right. I love the way you talk about your mother, the way you laugh when something genuinely surprises you, the way you eat food like you're actually present for it. I love that you hold people to their best selves, including me, especially me. A tear. She didn't even feel it happen. I love your ambition. I love every single thing you've built this past year. I love that you're standing in this airport at 5 in the morning choosing yourself. Because you should always choose yourself. He stopped close enough that she could have touched him without reaching. But I want to be someone you're choosing yourself toward, not away from. He paused, and then he said something softer, something more precise. Every inch of you, Brittany, not just the capable version, not the performing version, the one who sometimes wonders if people see her before they see everything else. The tired version, the afraid version, the one who walked away to protect herself. His voice dropped. Every inch of that is the person I love, not because you're perfect, because every part of you is you, and I wouldn't change any of it. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. She'd spent 6 years decoding his silences. This one she didn't need to decode. She could just feel it, warm and certain and real, the way the simplest truths always are. That took you a while, she said. He almost smiled. I know. Mincio's going to be insufferable about this. She already texted me 3 times on the drive over. She laughed. She actually laughed, and something cracked open in her chest in the best possible way. She looked at this complicated, restrained, trying harder than he knew man, and she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Something quiet, something like safety, not the absence of risk, the presence of someone who knew exactly who she was and had shown up anyway. I'm still taking the position, she said. I know. New York is real. What I built there is mine. I'm not giving that up. I'm not asking you to. He said it easily, like he'd already made peace with it. I told you. Distance is logistics. We figure it out. A beat. What I am asking is, let me be part of what you're building, not in front of it, not instead of it, just alongside it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the remaining distance between them and held him. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films. Just held him. Her head against his chest, his arms coming around her slowly like he was making sure she was real. They stood there in that pale airport corridor with flights being called around them and the world beginning to wake up outside, and for a long moment neither of them moved. It felt like rest. She missed her flight. She called the airline from his car, calm as anything, rescheduled. And Ji Huan, sitting beside her in the driver's seat, had the profound good sense not to say a single word about it. He just started the car. She glanced at him. Don't. I didn't say anything. You were thinking very loudly. He pulled out of the airport lot with the smallest possible smile and drove her back to the city as Seoul began to wake up around them. What came next was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. Because fairy tales skip the part where you actually learn someone, the unscripted, imperfect, deeply human part. And that's exactly the part Brittany and Ji-hwan got to have. She flew to New York 3 days later, properly rested and properly certain. Ji-hwan flew out 4 weeks after that. He'd planned a whole day, organized with characteristic precision, reservations, a car, a sequence. It was thoughtful and a little bit rigid and very him. She gently dismantled it within the first 40 minutes. I want to walk, she said. Can we just walk? He looked at his phone. We have a reservation at Ji-hwan. It's New York. We can eat anywhere. She was already moving down the sidewalk. Come on. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds, looking at his reservation app. Then he put his phone in his pocket and followed her. This is the part people don't tell you about falling in love with someone you've known for years. You think you already know them. Then you see them in a completely different context, away from the roles, away from the institution that defined you both, and you realize you've been holding a photograph of someone you're only now meeting in person. She was different in New York, not bigger or louder, just freer. She moved through the city like it was hers. She knew which subway to take and which blocks to avoid, and exactly which tiny restaurant on which impossible-to-find street did the thing she'd been missing. She introduced him to people she'd been collecting, artists, organizers, thinkers, with the easy warmth of someone who was finally building a world that matched her insides. He watched her like she was something worth watching. He tried a food from a corner cart that she insisted he'd like. He didn't like it. He said very carefully, "It's interesting." She looked at his face and burst out laughing, and he had the dignity to look mildly offended, which made it funnier. That evening, they sat on the steps outside her building, her slightly ridiculous, characterful, perfectly imperfect New York apartment building, and talked until the street quieted down around them. "What was the thing you thought you'd hate about New York?" she asked. "The noise." "And?" He thought about it. "I've gotten used to it faster than expected." "That's because you're learning to just be somewhere instead of always managing it." He looked at her. "Did your mother teach you to say things like that?" "Probably." She leaned her head back against the railing. "She taught me most of the important things." A pause. "Tell me something you've never told me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't actually like formal dinners. I've hosted hundreds of them. I've never enjoyed a single one." She stared at him. "You've never—" "6 years, Ji-hwan. You had them twice a month." "They were necessary." "Oh my God." She pressed a hand to her face. "All those years I thought you were in your element." "I was performing." "We were both performing at each other." "Apparently." She laughed. He laughed too, quieter but real. And they sat there on the steps of her building, 2 people who'd spent 6 years being professionally excellent at everything except honesty, finally just talking. Meeting her family properly was the experience Ji-hwan had not fully prepared himself for. He'd been in difficult rooms his entire life. He'd sat across from people who wanted things from him, who feared him, who tested him. He had protocols for all of it. Her father's living room in Atlanta had none of those protocols. Robert Williams was a quiet man with watchful eyes, a civil engineer's brain, and 30 years of marriage to a woman who read people like sheet music. He shook Ji-hwan's hand at the door, said, "Come on in," and spent the next 2 hours asking questions that sounded casual and weren't. And Evelyn Williams put food on the table and said almost nothing, and somehow saw everything. At some point in the evening, when Brittany had gone to the kitchen and Jihuan was alone for a moment with her parents, Robert Williams looked at him over the rim of his glass and said, "She's spent her whole life making sure everyone else was okay. You understand that?" "Yes, sir," Jihuan said. "I do." "Good." Robert set down his glass. "Because the person she needs doesn't need saving from her and doesn't need her to save them. That person just needs to show up." He let that sit for a moment. "You planning on showing up?" Jihuan held his gaze. "Consistently." Robert Williams nodded slowly. That was the end of the interview. Later that night, Marcus pulled Jihuan aside, ostensibly to show him something in the backyard, transparently to have a word. "I don't dislike you," Marcus said, which was somehow funnier for being delivered with complete seriousness. "I just want to be clear about something." He turned to face him. "She doesn't need a man who's impressed by how strong she is. She needs a man who notices when she's tired before she has to say it." He paused. Big difference. Ji Huan thought about the river walk, the Han River at night, the way she'd told him about waiting for someone to just want to know how she was doing, the way he'd said, "I did that to you," not defensively, just plainly. "I know the difference," he said. Marcus studied him. "All right then," he said, and went back inside. In Seoul, Jihuan's world received Brittany the way unfamiliar things sometimes surprise you, with unexpected warmth in unexpected places. Min Seo, who had been maneuvering toward this outcome for the better part of 2 years, was insufferably delighted and gracious enough to only mention it 3 or 4 times per conversation. His family was more formal, more layered. There were dinners where Brittany watched the choreography of how people positioned themselves around Jihuan. The deference, the care, the way everyone was slightly more careful in his presence. And she understood, in a new way, the particular loneliness of being the person the room organized itself around. She watched him move through it, and then she watched how he moved when they were alone afterward, the exhale, the loosening of the jaw, the way he'd reach for her hand not dramatically, but instinctively, like it just made sense. One of his aunts, a woman in her 60s with precise manners and kind eyes, pulled Brittany aside at a family gathering and said in careful English, "He's different with you." "Different how?" Brittany asked. The woman thought about it. Like he remembered something he'd forgotten. Brittany held that for a long time. There were arguments, too, because this was 2 real people, not a performance. She was blunt in a way that occasionally landed harder than she intended. He was private in a way that occasionally felt like withdrawal. She needed to process out loud. He needed to process alone. She thought his scheduling was rigid. He thought her spontaneity was occasionally chaotic. They had a genuinely heated argument about time zones and communication, specifically about his habit of being excellent at responding to everyone except the people closest to him. She said, "I am not one of your work obligations. You don't have to manage me. You just have to talk to me." He said after a long pause, "I know. I'm working on it." Which wasn't a grand gesture, wasn't a speech, but it was honest, and she'd learned by now that his honesty was where he kept his love. She said, "Okay," and they moved forward. That's what it looked like, not perfect, not effortless. 2 people choosing each other again every time the choosing was required. The New York event was Brittany's. She'd built it over 18 months, the largest cultural exchange showcase the organization had ever attempted. 2 cities, 2 nights, a vision that had come entirely from her own imagination and determination, and the specific kind of courage that develops when you stop waiting for permission. The venue was packed. When she finished speaking, thanking her team, her family, the artists who'd trusted her vision, she stepped back from the podium and looked out at the audience. Her mother was in the third row, beaming with the quiet intensity only mothers can manage. Marcus was beside her, applauding too hard, pretending he wasn't emotional, failing completely. Minseo was there too, because Minseo had made a personal policy of being present at important things, and she'd flown in from Seoul without being asked. And Jihuan. He was toward the back, not centered, not positioned to be noticed, just there, in a room full of noise and celebration and the culmination of everything she'd worked toward, just there, watching her the way she'd always wanted someone to watch her, not as an assistant, not as an accomplice, not as someone useful or impressive or strategically valuable, as the woman he loved. She smiled at him across the room. Real, uncomplicated. The kind she couldn't have manufactured even if she'd tried. He smiled back, and somewhere in that exchange, across a crowded room, no words, no drama. Something that had been quietly breaking for a very long time was quietly, completely whole. Brittany Williams spent years believing that love was something she had to earn, that if she stopped being capable, present, useful, it would disappear. She performed strength so long she forgot what it felt like to rest inside her own life. Jihuan spent years believing that needing someone and loving them were the same thing. He surrounded himself with loyalty and mistook it for intimacy. He was close to many people and truly known by almost none. And then, not instantly, not cleanly, not without real cost, they found each other in the space between what they'd always performed and who they actually were. Real love didn't look like the stories. It didn't announce itself dramatically. It built slowly through proximity and honesty and the quiet courage of letting someone see you on an ordinary day when you're not at your best. It looked like a man learning to show up without an agenda, a woman learning to let herself be held, an apology given plainly, a dream supported completely, an argument had and moved through, a family met and slowly, genuinely welcomed. It looked like two people choosing each other not because either one completed the other, but because they'd both finally found a place where they could breathe, where they could be imperfect, where they were, fully and without performance, seen. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. If this story found the part of you that needed to hear it, share it with the person it made you think of. You know exactly who.